What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here, and back to review the new movie Capone, starring Tom Hardy and written and directed and edited by Josh Trank. Now, this movie was originally intended to be released theatrically. Under the present conditions in which we all find ourselves, they decided to circumvent the theatrical window, and I would love nothing more than to be able to report that this movie is an absolutely fantastic gangster movie and well worth everybody's attention. But as I was watching the movie, I was reminded of the immortal words of director Frank Capra, where he said, "There are no rules in filmmaking, only sins, and the cardinal sin is dullness." And with that in mind, the nicest thing I can say about Capone is that it has a great cast that tries really hard, but this movie absolutely bored me out of my mind. And when it comes to director Josh Trank, the sad reality is I don't know if there'll ever be something more interesting about his career than the behind-the-scenes stories about what went down during his now notorious rise and fall while he was directing the 2015 reboot of Fantastic Four. This is a review of Capone, so I'm not going to relitigate all those details, but it is worth keeping in mind because after the film Chronicle, Josh Trank was a hot new director. He got tapped by Fox to direct one of the biggest properties that's ever come out of Marvel Comics, and he had a movie adaptation about the life of Boba Fett all lined up for Kathleen Kennedy over at Star Wars. But after the biblical-level disaster of Fantastic Four, his career went down in flames, and he's admitted in a lot of interviews that writing Capone was basically his therapy because while all these stories were going around about who deserved the blame about the failure of Fantastic Four, he started to get the idea for the screenplay about the last year of Al Capone's life, where in spite of only being in his late 40s, he was suffering from horrible dementia. All that was brought about from a pretty horrible case of neurosyphilis that was well underway before he ever got treated with any penicillin. And after being in jail for 10 years for income tax evasion, Capone was basically confined to his estate in Florida, where he was subjected to a lot of stories on the radio about his life, with no real way to control the narrative surrounding his criminal activities. Now, I find it kind of hilarious that Josh Trank would choose Al Capone to be the figure that he relates to while he's trying to process his experiences on Fantastic Four. But on paper, Capone could have been an interesting comeback for Josh Trank because the budget's much smaller, he didn't have to worry about nearly as much interference, and for his partner in crime, he had one of the most dynamic actors of his generation. I think Tom Hardy not only is one of the most talented actors of his generation, but as a movie star, he's carved a really interesting career, choosing some really good parts over the years. And ordinarily, the more stuff you have kind of disguising his face in terms of makeup or mask, the better his performances become. Whether you're talking about Dunkirk, Mad Max Fury Road, or The Dark Knight Rises, three of the biggest movies of the last 10 years. But having now endured this incredibly tiresome movie, where once again Josh Trank wrote, directed, and edited it, there's no way that he can shift the blame to other people. The failings of Capone are all his own. I've heard many conflicting reports about what went down on Fantastic Four. And even under the kindest circumstances, I feel like Josh Trank deserves a huge chunk of the blame. I think that blame is shared with Simon Kinberg, one of the least creative and one of the most successful people working in movies today. And if you want evidence of Simon Kinberg's creative failings, check out Dark Phoenix. But it seems to me now that with Fantastic Four, you had a situation where you had a screenplay that wasn't finished, a release date that couldn't be moved, which is always a recipe for disaster, especially if you have a very young, untested director who's not quite ready yet for the experience of being chewed up like hamburger meat by the studio system. And as somebody who loves the Fantastic Four in the 60s and in the 80s and in the early 2000s, whether you're talking about Stan Lee and Jack Kirby or the era of John Byrne or the insanely good era of writer Jonathan Hickman, I don't know if I'll ever forgive Josh Trank and Simon Kinberg for mangling that movie as horribly as they did. On the other hand, I do enjoy a good comeback story as much as anybody, and I was frankly really curious and open-minded going into Capone because I love Italian gangster movies. When it comes to that world, in particular the world of Al Capone, so many great filmmakers, as well as television writers, have taken a crack at Al Capone, going all the way back to the early 30s. And many of those filmmakers made movies that are such undeniable classics that they cast a very, very long shadow. So anytime you make a movie now about Al Capone or a TV show about Al Capone, you're inviting a lot of comparisons to some of the best movies ever made. And just to give you a few examples, in 1932, you had Howard Hawks making Scarface, a movie that was so fantastic it would get remade by De Palma in their early 80s. And then you have Ben Gazzara playing Capone in the 1970s. And my favorite version of the Al Capone story is Brian De Palma's film The Untouchables, where you had Robert De Niro chewing the scenery in each and every scene in which he appeared. That's more a movie about the people who took down Capone, but Robert De Niro did an amazing job with the character, in particular during the now infamous scene where he talks about baseball and enthusiasms before he cracks someone's head open with a baseball bat. That's probably the best version of the Al Capone story that we are ever likely to see. So there's no getting around the fact that filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola or Martin Scorsese or Abel Ferrara or Brian De Palma have been mining this world for a very, very long time with excellent results. And what's abundantly clear to me after watching Capone is that Josh Trank in no way, shape, or form deserves to be mentioned in the same breath with the rest of those directors. But if you had partnered Tom Hardy with one of those directors, who knows? We might have been talking about Oscars after this movie, because Tom Hardy is an incredibly game performer. He's up for anything. He's happy to take on any risk. But as written by Josh Trank, this movie's almost inadvertently a comedy where Tom Hardy delivers this incredibly hammy, over-the-top performance that I think is going to invite a lot of ridicule. He spends so much of the movie snarling and making impotent threats, or engaging in ridiculous behavior like singing alongside the Wizard of Oz, or taking multiple shits in his pants. One of the most memorable moments of the movie is when Linda Cardellini discovers that Al Capone has quite literally shit the bed, which is ironic because with this entire movie, Josh Trank has also shit the bed. We never really get an opportunity to figure out what made this character tick. And another thing working against this movie is that Stephen Graham's performance as Al Capone in the show Boardwalk Empire is still relatively fresh in a lot of people's minds. I thought that show was absolutely fantastic. And obviously Al Capone was not the star of that show, but he was still a major character. And making matters even worse for Josh Trank, Martin Scorsese released The Irishman last year, and admittedly, The Irishman has nothing to do with Al Capone, but it is a movie about aging mob figures looking back on their life. But I'm sorry, anytime a filmmaker decides to make a movie about aging gangsters within a year after Martin Scorsese has crafted a 3.5-hour epic on the same subject, the best case scenario is that you're going to come out looking like a rank amateur by comparison. But I've been kind of pummeling the movie at this point, so maybe I should talk about a few of the good things. Like I mentioned before, there is a great ensemble cast in this movie that's doing the best they can under the circumstances. And I think the strongest performance in the movie is actually by Matt Dillon, who at this point has been doing incredible work for almost 40 years, and yet he still looks like he's like 30 years old. I don't know what his secret is, but he's got this incredible sense of calm and naturalism and confidence. And in this movie, he basically plays a ghost who's haunting Al Capone. He was the victim of a particularly brutal torture sequence at one point. But Matt Dillon does such a great job in this, he almost makes Tom Hardy seem like some sort of cartoon parody that you might see in the world of Bugs Bunny. And probably the best scene in the movie, Al Capone, everybody calls Fonz, which is short for Alfonso, where they have a laid-back scene where they go fishing, and Al Capone gets frustrated because an alligator ends up stealing the fish that he's reeling in, and he ends up losing his fishing rod, going berserk, and then shooting the alligator with a shotgun. It's scenes like these where we realize that the film could have been an interesting character study of Al Capone, but where Josh Trank kind of loses his way, he actually tries to inject a little bit of plot into the movie in a way that's so clumsy and so shoved in that these scenes just start to feel horribly underdeveloped. What's abundantly clear as you watch this movie is that Josh Trank really would have benefited from having a kick-ass book to adapt as just a great jumping off point, because I do genuinely respect the fact that he's trying to make a film for adults with adult themes. It's not a franchise movie. But so much of the final product just feels lazy in execution. It actually feels a lot like a really forgettable episode of a TV show that we're never going to see. But what Josh Trank has forgotten is that with movies, it's all about mood and style and atmosphere. What is the visual language of the movie? And when it comes to the overall style, this movie is horribly lacking. But by far the weakest ingredient of the movie is this subplot about whether or not Al Capone might have managed to hide $10 million before his mind started to completely decay. His doctor, played by Cal MacLachlan's looking for it. His children are looking for it. He keeps having all these fantasies about where he might have buried it. And he's got the feds breathing down his neck, doing constant surveillance of his property, trying to figure out whether or not he'll reveal anything that might tip them off as to where this money might be hidden. And the fact that he's being constantly surveilled only exacerbates Al Capone's paranoia. So he's constantly screaming at people that he's seeing out in the woods, or he's having fantasies about going on a murder rampage with a gold-plated Tommy gun shooting everybody around him. There's one kind of interesting scene where he's having a flashback about a woman who's trying to seduce him, who's telling him to dig where it's wet, which is obviously a double entendre, both in terms of what she's trying to do to him, as well as where the money might be hidden. And then the scene explodes into violence with bullets coming through the window. It all has to do with the St. Valentine's Day massacre. So we get a few flashbacks of that late 20s, early 30s, kind of kick-ass classic gangster period. And the movie could have benefited from a lot more of those, because what we get is basically an hour and 40 minutes of Tom Hardy kind of hamming it up for the camera, chewing on carrots instead of cigars because the cigars get taken away from him by his doctor. And he's racked with guilt by some of his past actions. And there's kind of a nothing subplot of one of his illegitimate sons trying to reconnect with him, constantly trying to call him so he can get a sit down with his father. And I enjoyed seeing Linda Cardellini in the film. I've pretty much enjoyed her in everything I've seen her in for the last 20 years, back since the days of Freaks and Geeks. But there's so many actors in this movie who deserved a much better script to work with. Everything about this film just demanded a more sophisticated, more experienced, and more talented filmmaker. The scenes where that's really abundantly clear is during the giant dinner sequences with the entire family, where you can tell Josh Trank's trying to do everything in his power to capture this incredibly dynamic, colorful Italian culture, but he completely stumbles and trips over his feet. And you've got a lot of performers that you'll recognize from shows like The Sopranos, but their presence only served as a brutal reminder of just how incredible The Sopranos was in its heyday, and just how limp this film Capone is across the board. but every once in a while throughout the movie, you do get these moments or these shots where you're reminded that Josh Trank does have some potential as a filmmaker. During this one particularly elaborate fantasy where Al Capone goes on a murderous rampage, he falls into a lake on his property, and as he sits up, this alligator rises up between his legs. It was a fantastic shot. And I was like, yes, more of that, please. But it was just too little, too late. It comes very near the end of the movie after I've been grinding my teeth in frustration for an hour out of complete and total boredom. And right now, with so few new movies coming out, I'm kind of an easy mark. It doesn't take that much to entertain me. In any case, I think I've pummeled this movie enough at this point. I do think Josh Trank has some talent. I'm not quite sure what the future might hold for him as a director. But if his next movie sucks badly, I'm sorry. 3 strikes, you're out. But I hope you enjoyed this reaction and review, or at least found it useful. If you did, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. It's very helpful to me. And if you want to talk more about Italian gangster movies, give me a shout on Twitter @Colbrex. But thanks again for watching the video. I really appreciate it. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.